Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Toby DePaw, and I am the Foundation Development Senior Manager at People for Bikes. I'm super excited to have our presenters with us today from Avarna. And so I'm going to hand it off right to them. Before I do, I just want to thank all of our coalition members that make this virtual education series possible. So thank you for joining us. And if you're interested in becoming a member, you can reach out to us through rod@peopleforbikes.org, and I'll put that in the chat as well. So take it away.
Thanks so much, Toby. It's great to be here with all of you. I'll go ahead and introduce myself, and then I'll pass it to Aparna to introduce herself, and then we'll get started. So my name is Siana Carrillo Walker-Flom. My pronouns are she, her. I'm actually on Chumash land currently in California visiting family, but I'm typically on Muskogee Indigenous lands in the greater Atlanta area, and I'm a partner here at the Avarna Group. Aparna, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Aparna. I use she, hers pronouns, and I'm calling you from the homelands of the Kalapuya people in Eugene, Oregon. I'm one of the founding partners of the Avarna Group. And we have been working on diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, access, belonging, all those things in the outdoor and conservation space for nearly 10 years as a team. And even longer independently. And we've had the privilege of supporting People for Bikes for a few years now with diversity, equity, inclusion related work, and also have had the privilege of presenting at these industry webinars. And with that said, I'll hand it back off to Siana.
Thanks, Aparna. So welcome everyone to our webinar on recruitment, hiring, and retention. We'll be talking through some different ways to create equitable processes that center the people participating in them today. So in this webinar, we'll share inclusive practices from sourcing to offer, developing rubrics and structured interviews, and mitigating unconscious bias throughout all those processes. We'll also talk through life beyond recruitment and discuss some aspects of organizational structures and culture that can impact employee retention. So these practices may flex in particular situations, though it's important to stick closely to the guidelines we provide for you today, really to create the consistency that you want to see. And while Aparna has spent time in roles at Touch Recruiting, and I've been embedded in recruiting and people-facing teams, we are not experts in recruiting. A lot of you may be. And what we'll be doing today is really talking about aspects of recruitment and hiring where equity and inclusion can be integrated and positively impact DEI-related efforts at your organization. So today we're going to be using the acronym DEI throughout the webinar to refer to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you all may be coming from organizations or agencies that use different language to talk about this work. As Aparna sort of went through that alphabet soup that we find continues to get longer and longer. You might use DEI or DEIJ or DEJA or IDEA, RDI. We also recognize you might use completely different language that's outside of these acronyms that encompasses the very same work that we're talking about. And what we're really talking about is creating equitable recruiting and hiring systems and processes that bolster an inclusive environment that supports our staff to do their best work. So language is imperfect. Regardless of what you call it, we're here to talk about work that sort of falls within that realm. A little bit about logistics today. So we have an hour together. We'll do our best to deliver content in 45, 50 minutes. And then we really want to reserve the last 10 or 15 minutes for you all to ask us some questions. So please feel free to write those down, or if you'd like to share them in the chat, we'll hold them until the end and answer them during the Q&A. So I'll provide a little bit of framing for us. And like I said, we're going to be doing a lot of content delivery, but I'd love for you all to get a little bit of engagement with us. So we do something called a 1-minute paper in some of our workshops. And really what that is an opportunity for you to think more deeply on a topic. And so what I'd like for you to do is either write this down or think about this question in your head, and you will ask yourself, people recruitment, hiring and retention serves our company by blank. And you'll keep saying that sentence over and over again and filling in that blank for 1 minute. It might feel awkward at first. That's okay. You might find that your answers get more expansive and more authentic as you continue to do this. But I would love for you to participate in that exercise. And I'm going to actually set a 1-minute timer right now for us to do that. And at the end of that minute, you all are welcome to drop some answers in the chat that came to you that felt really resonating with you and the way that you hope your company or your company currently is really creating these equitable and inclusive systems. 1 minute is starting now. Okay, that's 1 minute. And I'm not sure, are we able to see the chat, Toby, if folks submit questions and you can just drop in the chat yes or no, and if not, that's okay. Okay, I'm gonna go with a no. Oh, yes. Okay, great. So awesome. Thank you so much, Christina. Yeah, so expanding your reach, people-centered recruitment, hiring, and retention serves your company by expanding your reach. Great. Any other responses that felt aligned with how you hope to see your work implemented at your companies or organizations? If they come to you, feel free to share. Some others that may have come to mind are that if you have people-centered recruitment, hiring, and retention practices and values, that relationships and well-being are valued, and you really need those relationships and the well-being of your staff to be valued so that you can support that full employee life cycle and create a really healthy company culture. If you highly value people-centered processes, you're going to be hiring the most qualified people. And to do that, you want to make sure that you're mitigating bias at every turn. Having these people-centered processes are going to allow a diversity of people to work at your organization and stay at your organization. And therefore, you all will get to be the most creative and most collaborative company, which is, I think, the goal of many of us. And then finally, creating a company that is mission and values aligned by having these really people-centered processes. So thank you all for participating in that 1 minute paper with us, and I'll go ahead and dive into the rest of the content. So if we're thinking about recruitment, yeah, awesome, thanks. If we're thinking about recruitment, we want to ensure that we're recruiting as often as possible. It shouldn't be this sort of one-time process that we're going through when we're searching to fill a specific role, but really an ongoing process. So you should be seeking to create relationships with individuals and organizations to make sure that you have this really broad network that Christina referenced to reach out to anytime that you're looking to hire someone. So think about having these coffee chats or one-on-ones or hosting conversations on topics that your company really cares about as a way to build that network. And some ways that you might want to think about casting that wider net are around building relationships beyond these sort of traditional channels that you might think about. So establishing relationships with HBCUs, especially if you have internship programs like Clark Atlanta University, or thinking about posting your jobs on In Solidarity. That is a job board that specifically advertises to outdoor and sort of travel related industries where you might find folks who are experienced in the bike world. And then advertising in sector agnostic arenas. So again, extending beyond those traditional cycling related job boards that you might be used to going to. If you want a grant writer who's aligned with your vision and values, think about a philanthropy job board or a nonprofit job board. If you want a marketing person, seek out people who are driven to mission-driven organizations that are excited about doing marketing work. If you're hiring a membership director, seek out individuals who have experience convening large groups of people. It's likely not crucial that they've done it specifically within the cycling industry. So think more expansively and more specifically about what experience is valuable rather than hyper-focusing on the industry. Next, we'll think about agency partnerships. So when using recruiters, ensure that they're familiar with your values around DEI, and know how to recruit to find talented candidates with marginalized identities. So if you're identifying a firm to work with, ensure you're asking those questions around how they integrate DEI into their own organization, as well as how they infuse it into their recruiting processes. And so we have some examples up here about firms that you might want to partner with. And you also want to think about building relationships with organizations that specifically support marginalized community groups. So up there, you see a picture of Honest Jobs. They specifically support formerly incarcerated folks. You may have heard of the Mom Project or Black Jobs or Pink Jobs. Those are job boards that are going to be supporting specifically marginalized communities who you want to bring into your organization and partner with. Next, you want to think about really identifying criteria for a successful search. So asking yourself, how will you know when you want to extend the search to ensure that you have a diversity of candidates and when you begin that selection process? There's really no best practices around this, but be sure to create a criteria before you cast your net. And to do this, some things you might want to consider are around what communities are underrepresented in your field or the specific role that you're hiring for. Understand how well these communities are represented at your company. Communicate these data points to the recruiting team or your agency partner, and then ensure that those members from the community groups that you'd like to see represented are in the candidate pools that you're interviewing for. And even with some of the discussion around how to ensure that you can still move DEI efforts forward, there has been a lot of conversation around DEI backlash. It's still okay to anonymously collect demographic data from your job applicants, and then determine the threshold of what qualifies as a successful search for your company. So we don't recommend setting numerical targets per se, based on some of the legal issues we've seen and folks really attacking those DEI efforts that folks have. But we think that, aiming for a race and gender diverse applicant pool before closing the position is okay, because you're not using race or gender to make your final selection. Okay, Aparna, I'll go ahead and pass it off to you. And if there's anything else you want to add on that legal front, feel free to do so.
I don't need to add anything on the legal front, though I will say we just ran a webinar all about that. So if you are curious at all about how to navigate the backlash against DEI, we also did an industry webinar on that last year or earlier this year, actually. And so, let us know. You can email us. Sienna will drop our email address in the chat if you're curious about that. So I kind of want to move from, Sienna's covered, the recruitment piece, how, the successful search piece. I want to move us to the actual job posting. So let me advance the slides. Sorry, we're working with Canva for the first time and navigation is a little weird. Okay, so when you're ready to hire for a particular position, of course, you're creating a job description, right? And this is a big piece of inclusive recruiting and actually getting a diversity of candidates to apply. And oftentimes people just don't think about the job description itself as one piece of how you attract a wider range of candidates. You want to make sure that if folks are applying for a job at your company or organization, they know what they're applying for. It's clear. So we have some tips on here. We're going to share these slides with you all as well because and so we're kind of viewing these slides for you all as a toolkit you all can use in your recruitment. So on the left, you see that, be specific and concise. So creating a job title, for example, that accurately reflects the day-to-day job. There's a bigger conversation here, but like oftentimes we'll see titles like just like associate, manager, but like be more specific. Like, what is their job about? The job description itself doesn't need to have everything in it. Too much can be overwhelming, and clarity is key. So make sure to provide day-to-day responsibilities with a few examples of the types of programs or tasks that they'll be overseeing, and just enough information for them to do their research. We have goodbye cover letters in here, and we'll mention it again later, but cover letters, asking for cover letters is this very like traditional thing that doesn't necessarily add value to the process and can create additional barriers for people. And I'll explain what those barriers are in a bit. The middle you'll see here is needs versus nice to have. So only ask for the bare necessities in a job description versus what you think might be like a preference or nice to have. And this actually allows all applicants to apply. For example, there's a study that shows that across gender, and the study was in the gender binary, but men apply for jobs when they can check off 6 out of 10 boxes on a list of qualifications, whereas women only apply when they check off all 10. So what that means is you might be losing out on some really, really qualified candidates by trying to be over inclusive and like everything you want in your job description that might be nice to have. So just take out anything that's not absolutely required in your job posting. You can actually ask about those preferred qualifications or helpful qualifications later on in the interview. So the other thing here, and we have on the right side, is before asking for a qualification, ask yourself if it's an essential skill, or if it is a nice to have or a characteristic. We recommend that you, actually, I'm going to go back to the left here. There's one more thing I want to say about the nice to haves, because there's a bike industry reference that you might all find really helpful on preferred qualifications. And we actually worked with a company many years ago that removed the statement bike industry experience preferred from their job posting. And that automatically increased the number of women candidates who actually applied for that position and were eventually hired. So again, ask yourself, is it really important for this person to have like a bike industry specific CV or background, especially if they're in a role that doesn't necessarily require them to have that experience, like finance or web development. Okay, now I want to go to the right side, which is skills versus characteristics. You're not here to make a judgment on someone's character when you are, considering them for a job. Really, it's about their skills. You want to make sure they have a positive, like they can add to the culture. And we'll talk about culture add later. That they're respectful. But when you have language in your job posting like positive attitude, sense of humor, often that's really more about their personality. So just ask yourself what you're looking for in the skill set there. So for example, if you're thinking about a positive attitude, what you actually might be looking for skill-wise is that person is able to work effectively in a team setting, especially with people who are different from themselves, right? That's the actual skill. So make sure that each of those lines translates to an actual skill. And then consider what's teachable versus what's not teachable. That's the last bullet point here on the right. Oftentimes companies prioritize skills that are more easily teachable, like proficiency in a particular like app or computer program, or if you're doing like bike trails development, ability to use a chainsaw or something like that. And I understand that could be important in certain positions. But then there are also less teachable qualifications that usually aren't listed or aren't considered as valuable, like interpersonal skills, ability to contribute to an inclusive team culture. And those skills are often harder. There's this sort of false binary of technical versus quote unquote soft skills. And people think about technical as harder and soft skills as easier. But the reality is technical skills, most of them, you can learn or get certified, right? You're building those skills. And sometimes those soft skills are harder to learn, those interpersonal skills. So make sure you're asking about both, and think about what's more easily teachable so that you're not losing out on candidates who may not have like a particular certification that they can get before they start the job, or even the first few days of the job. Okay, so I want to continue talking about job descriptions, and I want to talk about kind of the culture and DEI aspect of job descriptions. if you're wanting someone to come in who can build an inclusive culture or support your inclusive culture in your organization, you want to include criteria that asks people whether to effectively work they've effectively worked across differences in the past. So you can ask for demonstrated experience, either personally in their volunteer work. It can be personal, it can be professional, how they've contributed to creating an inclusive culture in a group setting. That's that first bullet. You can also ask them about their commitment to DEI values or the equivalent, whatever acronym or non-acronym that you use. If your company does value equity, does value inclusion, be clear that you want your candidates to also come in with those shared values. And to demonstrate that, this can be something like through personal and community engagement, or just a demonstrated understanding of these concepts and how they're important in the bike sector. We'll get more into how to assess for this later on in the webinar. We also want to allow space for people to share their non-work or non-industry related experience. That's often some of the meatiest pieces of an application, is when folks are able to kind of freeform share how they think they can add to your company or your organization. Also invite folks to apply for the job regardless of whether they meet all the listed qualifications. I talked about that study earlier, right? About women and men and women having this what's called the confidence gap of not applying for jobs unless they can check off all 10 boxes. Studies show that when you actually explicitly add something at the end of your job description, like something like, these requirements are guidelines, not hard and fast rules. If you have 75% of the qualifications that we just listed, we encourage you to apply. You can actually list that at the bottom of your job experience. That language I just rattled off is from the National Wildlife Federation. And what research shows is that when you actually explicitly invite people to apply, and say that applying gives you an opportunity to be considered, so we invite you to apply regardless of whether you meet all of what we listed. You actually can get invite people who are actually qualified and add value to your company. The second to last bullet is about an invitation for folks from underrepresented groups to apply. There's a lot happening around the legal landscape of DEI, but one thing that you can continue to do without stating that it's a preference or anything is just encouraging people who are underrepresented at your company. So you can say, we invite BIPOC or people of color or LGBTQIA or women, naming identities and saying, we invite you to apply or encourage you to apply, can also signal to folks from these communities that they are welcome at your company. And then I'm going to repeat again at the end here, avoid that hard and soft skills language. Just be explicit about the type of skills you're looking for. So, relationship development, teamwork, community building, interpersonal skills, feedback, all of that. You can name those really clearly versus saying soft skills. Okay, the next slide is about what not to put in your job description. You want to avoid requirements that can typically, researchers showed, can exclude people based on their identities and backgrounds. So for example, asking for particular degrees, unless it's absolutely necessary to the job, even asking for a degree, you might want to question that. So let's say, I don't know, you're hiring somebody who is doing conservation, like trails conservation work. Perhaps that person does not need a degree in conservation or natural resources management, but they have been doing a lot of kind of adjacent work on working with communities on planning parks or something like that. Or they've volunteered, but they maybe don't have those actual degree in trail building. That person's knowledge and background and skills just as relevant, even if they don't have a very specific degree. So this degree bias is something we see a lot in job descriptions. Similarly, asking them to have a particular skill that can be easily obtained through a certification, like chainsaw. I'm thinking about trails, bike trails right now, because that's a lot of what I do here. But having them requiring specific certifications is something that you also can reconsider. You should reconsider, because that's something they can easily do before the job starts or the first few months of the job. Also avoid requirements such as ability to lift 25 pounds unless that's actually necessary for the job. It's something that people will sort of just put into every job, even if it's a job that's a computer job. That can create really strong disability bias that deters people with physical disabilities from actually applying for jobs that they're very capable of performing. And then also avoid asking for extracurricular activities or personal interests or hobbies. There is a really interesting study that shows that hiring managers have a bias of hiring people whose hobbies and interests align with theirs. And then oftentimes there's also a class intersection there, especially in outdoor recreation. And so there was a study where there were identical resumes, and there was one candidate who listed sailing, polo, and classical music as their interests. And then these were all fake, but this was just part of the study. The other very identical resume listed track and field, soccer, and country music. And in that study, there was a bias in favor of the first resume. And it was like a class sort of elite bias that the person who was interested in sailing and polo and classical music, there was a bias that they were more qualified than the person that was interested in or had a interest in track or soccer and country music. So there's a lot of really interesting conversations we can have about that study. But what I will say in short is that asking for personal interests and hobbies, unless it's like directly relevant to the job, just adds more to the bias that might come into play. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is the essentials, the essential information you want to include in a job description, a little bit of do's and don'ts. So do disclose the salary range. Ensure you've done your due diligence in your market research to be able to offer a competitive salary for this role. Include the range. You don't want to waste that person's time if they can't afford this job. You don't want to waste your time if a bunch of people apply who are not able to actually do the job because of the salary. So just be upfront about the salary. Don't add in salary negotiations or don't negotiate salary. As a company, salary negotiations can create significant inequity in how individuals are paid for the same role based on their comfort in negotiating. So there's historical research that showed that men were more likely to negotiate their salaries than women, which led to pay inequities across a number of different sectors. There was a study last year by the Pew Foundation that found that that differentials is decreasing, that women are almost as likely as men to negotiate their salaries, but they're still less likely, as are people of color, to negotiate. And they're often more often penalized for actually negotiating, right? They're thought of as like, oh, aggressive. So negotiations can be kind of a little bit of murky waters. Also, do not ask for salary history. It's actually illegal in several states to ask for salary history. And oftentimes it's just used as to justify paying people lower salaries. You should be paying people what they're worth in your company rather than what another organization has paid them before. It's just about their skills and what value they're adding. It's not about what other jobs they've had and how much they've been paid. Similarly, don't ask for salary requirements. So that is like asking people what salary they need, because their pay shouldn't be based on what they need. Their pay should be based on their skills, and it should be competitive. It should have nothing to do with how much they need to get by. Okay, I want to talk about another essential to put in your job posting, which is any benefits that you have at your company or organization. We're not going to go into deep detail around what should be in a benefits package, but I want to say it's important to disclose information about healthcare, about paid time off, parental leave, um, and on healthcare, whether family members are covered, on paid time off, what they can use it for, parental leave, and whether you have it for all parents of all genders, retirement funds, professional development that's available, any other auxiliary benefits like wellness or gym membership or meal stipends, that kind of thing. And then this is an interesting one that we don't often see in job descriptions, but I think it's really important to talk about the actual work environment that the person is going to be working in. And a lot of this has shifted since COVID as people are working in more remote environments, but adding in details on whether it's an in-office, remote, or hybrid role, if it's remote, where people can work from. And then also if you're asking people to come to the office, describing the office space and its accessibility features, that's what you see on the right, making sure that you're talking about, what's the floor plan like? Will they be in a cubicle? Will it be loud? One thing we found is there are increasingly people who identify as neurodivergent, or neuroatypical. And I think part of neuroaccessibility is to make sure that you are creating office spaces where people can effectively work. And so disclosing this information can really help a person figure out if this is like the right work environment for them. And then in the middle, if it is a remote position, I think, as you all know, people are struggling with culture in a mostly remote work environment. So add in some information about how you're building team culture virtually, whether it's, donuts or coffee chats or happy hours and that kind of thing. Okay, couple more slides here on job descriptions. I want to talk about a note on language. It's important to use accessible language in your job description and steer clear of jargons and acronyms, which you see a lot of in the outdoor industry and the bike sector. Using that kind of jargon can just only contributes to how exclusive a person might think your company is, especially as they are onboarding. And if there is jargon that's important for their specific role, like, you can share that information during onboarding. You don't need to use it in a job description as like a test. Also say what you mean, avoid coded language. So what we mean by that is sometimes words like diverse or urban or inner city or underserved, at least in the DEI space, those are all code for low income communities of color. When we use that kind of coded language, it exacerbates negative and false assumptions about particular groups of people. So it's important to be specific. Like, if you're hiring an outreach person or partnerships manager in a geography where, for example, you want to attract more Latina ridership, you can say, experience working with a Latina community. So that is all to say, just be specific about particular communities and identities. Ambiguity does a disservice to us. And then finally, check the gender and style bias of your words. Certain words and phrases in job descriptions may signal to someone that they may not be a good fit to work at your company, even if you don't mean to use it in that way. So there was a study of 4,000 jobs in the tech sector, and it found that postings for, and it wasn't in the tech sector, it was across a number of different sectors, as far as I remember. But the study found that postings for jobs dominated by men in that space had a higher frequency of words like lead, direct, determined, superior. And postings for jobs dominated by women had words like collaborate, committed, responsive, self-aware. And so researchers also found that women were more interested in jobs when descriptions had a balance of those words, not just like the words that I just mentioned around collaborate. And so having this sort of, it's hard to think about words as being gendered, but the research shows that they are in some ways, and they can signal whether, at least in terms of gender, whether a person can feel welcome in that space. So there are actually tools online that actually check gender bias in your language, which is super interesting. And then be transparent and accessible during the application process. So share your timeline and process, because most people are applying for multiple jobs. Be transparent about whether you're considering an internal candidate versus an external candidate. And if you actually have that preference, ask yourself why. Because remember that having fresh eyes on your systems and policies and culture and practice can be a value add. If you prefer an internal candidate, like they really prefer an internal candidate, be able to explain why. Again, avoid requesting cover letters. They can be a significant barrier for people who are really qualified for a role but are not strong writers. It's unlikely that you'll make a decision about a candidate just based on a cover letter. And they can share a lot of that information in their interviews. Endeavor to make your application process itself accessible. So if you're using an online platform, check for accessibility features, and continue to be flexible around accessibility needs. Make sure, like, if you're asking people to come into the office, people can actually physically be there. And again, that any online platform is also accessible. So you can do this by just specifically asking candidates, what are your accessibility needs? Okay, Now I want to talk about your hiring committee. Make sure to create a hiring committee that's diverse across your company and the hierarchy and even identity. Um, Doing this, can actually mitigate bias and increase inclusion because candidates end up feeling more welcomed when there are people who share their identities interviewing them. It also helps people on your own team feel more welcome and valued when they're asked to be part of a hiring committee. It's actually a leadership development opportunity. So that's important. That said, select your hiring committee with intention. So sometimes people of color are used as what we call diversity cover in hiring committees. They're just asked time and time again to be part of a committee because they are quote unquote diverse, and then their input isn't as valued. And this can feel tokenizing, tiring, frustrating for people of color who are asked to be part of hiring decisions over and over again. So when you do ask them to be part of your committee, make sure they're enthusiastically willing to do so. Also select committee members who are bought into the values of your company and the mission, as well as DEI, so that you don't have to make a case for DEI along the way. And then establish a clear decision-making process. Sometimes, committee chairs will just pay lip service to the other people on the committee and just make that sort of executive decision, which doesn't make anyone feel valued. So have a clear decision-making process before you go into the hiring. Say, we have a 3-person committee and it's going to be by vote, or we're going to have a consensus. These decision-making processes can look different, but on the right, you have directive, which we don't advise, consultative, where like you have a hiring chair who makes a decision but considers everyone's input. Voting, you know what that is. Consensus, where there's 100% agreement. And then sometimes consensus -1, where everybody but one person agrees on the final decision. Okay, so now I'm going to move to the screening process. This can take a long time to screen resumes, but it's well worth the effort to do this. So first thing we say is to scrub the resumes of some identifying information during the screening process, because that mitigates race, gender, and other kinds of affinity bias. So people have an affinity for people who are more like them. There's a whole bunch of research that talks about how there's gender bias with male and female sounding names, or race bias with white and non-white sounding names. So just you can have someone who's not part of the hiring team just initially mark out names. And sometimes you also want them to mark out like geography or past employers, especially if you have kind of a bias in favor of certain companies in the outdoor industry. Just notice if any other bias is creeping in. Mark that out during the screening, and then you can revisit once you're at the next level of the process. Also use a rubric to select candidates for the interview. A rubric is similar to a score sheet. It provides a standardized process to assess candidates, and it could be created and reviewed by the hiring team before you go into the process together. And we have examples. If you go to our website, we have a hiring toolkit that has examples of a rubric, but you can create, what happens is every skill or qualification ends up being scored for a certain number of points. You can ask within your hiring team, you might say, which skills are more important, which are less important. We'll assign them less points. What does a good answer look like in an interview? And what does like a mediocre answer look like? So that allows you to be a little more objective and allow less bias to creep into the interview process. Okay, I want to continue to talk about bias. We all have bias. We're never going to get rid of it. Most simply, you can think about bias as, or at least unconscious bias, as the lens through which we see the world. And with that said, it's important to identify and mitigate any biases, unconscious biases we may have that unintentionally exclude people with certain identities, based on these like narratives that we were programmed with that we may not be even aware of. So the first is family obligation bias. There's actually research that shows that if someone discloses they're a member of a parent-teacher association or have taken some time off to be a stay-at-home parent, that historically is counted against the candidate, and that these candidates were 79% less likely to be hired in one study and offered an average of $11,000 less in salary. There's also communication and style bias. So, recognizing how people communicate can look like a lot of different things, and the biases show up in a few different ways. Um, there is a bias against people who are less direct communicators and more storytellers. Bulleted lists of accomplishments are overvalued over narratives, and whereas narratives can actually demonstrate people like being good storytellers, which is really helpful for like community building. Yet we end up devaluing that, and we value sort of the direct. Basically, what we're doing in this presentation is very direct communication. This is valued. And then also there's accent bias. How you perceive people's candidacy is impacted by the accent they have. Body language bias as well. Like Western culture often values particular body language, like a firm handshake, eye contact, modulated tones. And then judging people by this body language can unfairly dock people of color, immigrants, women, neurodivergent, neurodistinct people, non-binary, queer people. So that's another thing. And the final, I'm still on communication and style bias here, but the last communication and style bias piece that often comes up is how people dress and look. And when there is research again that shows that people of color, LGBTQ folks, women, people who identify as fat or plus sized, disabled people are more harshly judged for their physical appearance. So catching this is important. You can even add this like to your rubric as is this bias creeping in? Um, and then the third bullet on the screen is around output versus input. Oftentimes output like awards, recognition, accomplishments, things you produce are more valued over input, which is relationships you've built, cultural knowledge that you've accessed, time you've spent engaging in advocacy. And the latter is not as legitimized as the former. And so again, ask yourself, am I having an output bias? And then the last bias that often comes into play is hit the ground running bias, the common refrain of like, well, I want a candidate to hit the ground running, which ends up leading to cloning, the phenomenon of hiring someone just like you because you assume they'll be able to do the best job, which is not actually true. It also assumes that people who had similar jobs before might be able to transition more smoothly into working for your company, when the reality is like every company and organization is different. And this bias, this sort of refrain of hitting the ground running, really requires people to immediately assimilate to the way things have been done at your company, and precludes you from hiring someone who might be more reflective and mindful, and perhaps even question and critique these systems that they've inherited. And it also favors people with access to particular experiences and creates barriers. So anyway, there's so many barriers that this presents. So keep an eye out for that one. Okay. I have interview logistics here, and this is really around making sure that interview is accessible and that you're mitigating bias. On the left is, again, ask for accessibility needs, ensure whatever platform you're using can support their needs, whether it's Zoom or Teams or whatever, or in person. Think about the medium. Use the same medium for all candidates, regardless of their location, because research shows that when some people can show up in person, there's a bias in their favor. If candidates do travel, cover their travel costs. And then there's some additional considerations we have here, is like, don't ask candidates, make sure you have a welcoming space. Don't ask candidates to engage in time-consuming projects to demonstrate their candidacy unless you pay for their time. And then be open to providing feedback to candidates after the process. It's really helpful and a really good way to build community relationships with them, because maybe they're not a good fit for this job, but they could be a good fit for a job in the future. Regarding interview questions, make sure to have a standardized set of questions, work on those questions ahead of time with your hiring committee, and make sure, again, with that rubric, to identify what a high quality response will be. Um, and then send questions to candidates ahead of time. It's always great because oftentimes people's initial reaction is, oh, this gives them an unfair advantage. But, unless thinking on your feet is an actual skill you're looking for in a job, in that person's job, it's more helpful to give them time to actually do the research and prepare for the interview. So give them questions ahead of time. The middle here is around integrating DEI concepts. It's really important to think about how you're going to ask about DEI without that sort of token DEI question. There are a lot of ways to ask about it. You can ask them how well they work across differences. You can ask them about work done with particular communities. So don't think of this as a box check. And then finally, ask open-ended questions. Again, value people's storytelling styles, give people time to process. That demonstrates a commitment to valuing process as much as outcomes. And then at the end, you can ask folks if there's anything that they want to share that you didn't ask about. Okay, almost done with the hiring, and then I'm going to hand it off to Sienna to talk about a couple of other pieces. During candidate selection, it's important to avoid, so you're at the end of the process now, you've interviewed, you want to make sure that you avoid automatic eliminators like, oh, they had a typo in their resume. That shouldn't be grounds for automatically disqualifying folks. Imperfection is okay. We're all human. Also, make sure you're thinking about a values fit and not a culture fit. You can think about it as a culture add, but not a culture fit, because we don't want to replicate current cultures if current cultures are not welcoming for folks. And so one thing you can do is like think about like, oh, if they're a mountain biker and your bike company, does that mean that they're a better fit for working with your company? Maybe not. Maybe they don't have shared values. So you can really think about how to hire people who maybe have very different cultures, who might be culture adds to your organization, because you want to build a culture that is more welcoming for a broader group of people. And then finally, communicate honestly and in a timely manner with folks. Really, what this means is that tell them if they didn't receive an interview, offer them feedback. As I mentioned before, it's a really good opportunity to maintain a relationship in case they're a good fit for the future. Okay, I'm going to hand it off to Sienna to close us off with what happens after you hire someone.
Thanks, Aparna. So I'm going to talk a little bit about retention. I think that's something that's not often talked about in conversations around recruiting. And we're not going to go into all the ways you can support employee retention, but we want to urge you to remember to consider the full life cycle of the employee when you're thinking about your recruitment strategy, including asking questions to yourself around whether people infrastructure is set up to support this candidate should they get hired. So do you have policies in place to support caregivers, or is there a mentorship program established to support employees who are new to the workforce? And then also asking yourself questions around whether the company culture is grounded in inclusion. So again, we want to see those culture adds or value adds, and asking yourself whether or not the culture is flexible enough to create space for and value people who think differently and welcome new ways of doing. And if not, it's really important to get those systems set up so that you don't have this sort of revolving door of folks leaving your company after 6 months to a year because they're finding that they can't be successful in your existing company culture. So as a part of retention, one of the pieces I'm going to talk about is onboarding. So like Aparna said, what do we do after we hire these folks? And again, onboarding is not something that's technically a part of recruitment, but recruitment efforts are only as successful as the culture and the structures that are set up to support employee retention. So having a clear and structured onboarding process helps to orient new staff not only to some of the standard aspects of the company and their role, but also gives an opportunity to orient them to the company culture and to jumpstart that people building and relationship building process. So if you're onboarding more than one person, I'm going to give a couple overviews. If you're onboarding more than one person in a relatively similar time frame, getting them started together and onboarding them together can be really helpful to provide a group onboarding process and really allow them to start to build some relationships with another new employee. And in addition, again, to them being bought into the mission and values of the company and the vision, that's of course why they're a big part of why they're there. A big part of what keeps them there is establishing relationships with the folks that they're either coming into the company with or getting to know people and building those strong relationships that they're going to depend on in their success at the company. So next, I'll talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts, beyond the nuts and bolts of onboarding. So in addition to some of those standard pieces, like, of course, you're going to talk about HR-related documentation and go over the staff directory and annual review timelines. you really want to talk about some of these additional pieces, like the organizational mission, vision, values, and strategy. So I'm sure they did a lot of research in preparing for their interview around, the mission and vision, but it's also helpful to just reorient new employees to your company's strategy so they can always have that to hold on to that North Star and really know what they're working towards and what they're working to support. You want to also go over communication platforms and how they're used. So, for example, you might have a structure that says we use Slack for these really quick updates individually or across teams, company wide, and they're not, what we're using Slack for is not tied to deliverables. So you don't want to, put a deliverable ask into a Slack message that might disappear, or someone's away on vacation, they don't see it. You really use it for casual chats. So maybe you use donuts or coffee chats. And then you want to share, we use emails for those substantial updates that are tied to deliverables, et cetera. This really supports folks to not have to figure these aspects out of the culture through trial and error, which can be really difficult and again, helps them with that ramp up time. Talking about communication norms regarding hierarchy specifically. So letting people know, is there an open door policy for senior leaders at the company, i.e., I can just Slack them or put time on their calendar, or do I need to reach out to an executive assistant to schedule time? These are pieces, that are not written down in a handbook somewhere. They're parts of the culture that people tend to learn over time. But for new folks, they can be really frustrating, especially if you're coming from a company culture like has happened for me that didn't have executive assistants, and you would just walk into, the executive director's office to set some time up with them or just to check in with them. And then going to a company culture that is really hierarchical, you have to reach out to an executive assistant. If they reach out to the CEO directly, and then sort of through error find out that that's not how the company operates, it's really nice to sort of have those pieces in place so they have an understanding, and again, can ramp up in the culture a lot more quickly. Organized social groups. So that's another thing to share with folks. If you have book clubs or affinity groups or gardening clubs that already exist and are places where people can go to and already start to build those relationships, it's great to share that during onboarding. Talking about company cultural norms. So again, these are norms that are typically not written down, but tend to be a part of the company culture that people learn over time. And some examples of those are, maybe you all tend not to schedule internal meetings before 10 a.m. or after 4 p.m., or you don't schedule meetings on Fridays, or if you have virtual meetings, people are welcome to be on or off camera. Sharing norms like this can be really helpful for new employees to feel more included, ramp up in the company culture a lot more quickly, and feel like it's an inclusive and supportive place for them to be. Again, important to have something like a buddy program that, again, if you don't have another person that people are onboarding with, having an existing employee that can share a little bit about some institutional knowledge, maybe share some more of those cultural norms that I'm talking about through casual lunch, or just an opportunity to check in with someone who's been at the company and they have an opportunity to ask questions to, can be really supportive for them. The next piece you want to ensure around retention is making sure that the people infrastructure is set up to support these folks you're bringing in. So again, I know that typically a lot of recruitment conversations are focused on that front part of the cycle, but making sure you have these established relationships with folks who tend to hold some of these pieces more regularly, other folks on HR teams or people-facing teams, to make sure that you have job descriptions that are updated regularly. That's a place that we hear folks saying, I'm was brought in to do one job, that work has evolved, and that evolution has not been reflected in my job description. And because job descriptions are really set the parameters for the scope of work and serve as that backbone for setting aligned goals, they really need to stay updated. Regular performance reviews, so having that established and standardized performance review process supports staff to stay on track to the goals that they've created in partnership with their managers. And without this established process, employees either don't receive regular and consistent feedback on their performance, or they have to advocate for that feedback, and it creates this inequity in evaluation and on what basis that evaluation is happening. And it can also lead to pay inequity. And then finally, having a work plan process that folks are really creating a work plan that, of course, for the business is supportive because it ensures that they're on track to meet the goals that they've set for that year. But for the employee, it provides them this really clear direction to achieve the goals they've set for themselves. And that lack of clarity on your role without something like a work plan and how it supports the business impacts retention in a few ways. One of them is if employees are not clear about how their work moves the business forward or what tangible steps they need to take to achieve their goals, they may question their efficacy in their role and whether they're valuable at the company. The next piece is talking about professional development. So employees want to not only do a good job in their role, but they want to grow. So providing opportunities to gain new skills really demonstrates that there's an investment in them, and again, is more likely to have them retained at the company. And manager support and training. So one of the most significant factors in employee retention is their direct manager. A 2022 study found that 82% of respondents said that they would consider leaving their jobs because of a bad manager. So if recruiting teams want to spend more time connecting with great talent and less time backfilling roles that they just hired for, companies have to invest in resources in consistently training their people managers, and also remembering that being good at your job does not mean that you would also be good at managing people who do that same job. People management is an entirely different skill set. Lastly, I'll touch on building relationships. So we've been talking about the importance of building relationships as a strong basis for people being retained at a company or an organization. And one of the ways you can do that is having a mentorship program. And you can either have an internal mentorship program where folks have an opportunity to connect with someone outside of their direct manager to support them and their growth, providing them an opportunity to really troubleshoot through challenges and excel in their role in a really unique way. Or you could invest resources in investing in an external mentorship program where you partner with another organization who offers that service, or a like-minded organization that's in the same industry where you can provide that mentorship opportunity. And then social communities. So people need people. We were not built to exist in isolation. And if we didn't know that before, the pandemic demonstrated that for us in a really significant way. So figuring out how to create community in a virtual or hybrid environment it has been a really big challenge over the last few years, especially since we all sort of went remote or hybrid. So I've listed a couple platforms that can support with making that a little bit more accessible, whether that's Confetti for team building or plugins like Donut through Slack that pair you with different people in your company to just meet them and have conversation. It's another great way to do that. Or you can have ERGs, employee resource groups, a place where folks come together around a shared identity to talk about their experiences, or having other types of social community groups, like I mentioned, a gardening club or book club, another way for people to really just come together and build community. So, too often I really see recruiting teams that are siloed off and rarely have an intentional touch point with the teams that are traditionally holding those aspects of retention. Again, whether that's folks on HR or other people facing teams. And successful recruiting is not only concerned with the beginning of the employee life cycle, but understands that they operate as a crucial part of the employee ecosystem. Successful recruiting is invested in people and employee retention and builds interdepartmental relationships to ensure employee success. So I'm going to stop there, and I know we only have a few minutes left, but I hope that what we've shared with you all has been supportive, and I would love to see if anyone has questions, or if there are any questions already in the chat that we can answer for you all. And if not, you're also welcome to shoot us a note on the email that Toby put in the chat. Okay, I don't see any questions coming through. We will also be sharing the slide deck with Toby, and Toby's going to be sending out the recording to you all as well. So if anything comes up after this discussion, please feel free to reach out. It was great to be here with all of you. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, everybody.